Welcome to another conversation at the table. How is your Friday night going? If you're watching us now, that means you're missing Princeton. Princeton is, at least last I checked, up on Creighton. It's been quite an eventful last couple of weekends with March Madness, and if you're like me, your bracket is busted, so now you just sit back and enjoy the games. By the way, congratulations, Josh, Isabel, on the arrival of little Taylor. We have a new addition at the table of Los Fresnos, and we're really, really excited for Josh and Isabel. We're praying that the mother, Isabel, and Taylor will continue their recovery and they'll continue to be healthy. And so we're pretty excited for that family. Join us for worship on Sunday. We'll be meeting again at the Los Fresnos Community Center. We meet on Sundays at 10:30. If you don't have a home church, I welcome you to show up. We're not perfect, but one thing I can say definitively is that Jesus will be there. In fact, we're going to talk about that in just a couple seconds. Jesus is there on Sundays among us and with us. And so I invite you to take some time on Sunday and join us at the table. During these 40 days of Lent, we've been using a devotional that was written by Kyle Jones and Catherine Strock. It's the Lenten devotional. It's the Sinner Saint Lenten devotional. And today, it's kind of interesting, looking at a very interesting text in Hebrews chapter 2, one that we just kind of pass over. We don't think too much about, but it's fascinating. I find it fascinating, so I thought we'd spend some time thinking about it. There was a story that showed up over the past couple of weeks. Apparently, some worship leader got in trouble with someone who has actually trademarked worship leader. And so they sent him a cease and desist. Now, there were some other things going on, I'm sure, but they sent him a cease and desist, and sure enough, Patent Office has a patent for the term worship leader, which I kind of find interesting. So I guess our worship leaders will have to call themselves something else. Probably not. But anyway, just interesting story. But that has to do with our subject today or tonight. Have you ever thought about who is the worship leader? Now, we have one at the table who all does a great job. And I'm sure wherever you're at on Sundays, you've got a really good one too. But who is the worship leader? It's a fascinating passage in Hebrews, which is a book in the New Testament. It's actually a really long sermon. We're not sure who wrote it, though most think the Apostle Paul. Paul, the great missionary, wrote it. I tend to think it was probably one of Paul's friends, somebody who was close to Paul. But regardless, whoever wrote it, the writer of Hebrews, has this fascinating thing in talking about Jesus' death and his resurrection and what it means to the congregations to whom he is writing. And this is what he says. We do see Jesus, this is Hebrews 2, starting with verse 9. We do see Jesus made lower than the angels, which is a reference, by the way, to Psalm 8. He was made lower than the angels for a short time so that by God's grace he might taste death for everyone, crowned with glory and honor because he suffered death. For in bringing many sons and daughters to glory, it was entirely appropriate that God, for whom and through whom all things exist, should make the pioneer of their salvation perfect through sufferings. For the one who sanctifies and those who are sanctified all have the same Father. By the way, this word sanctify here, in this context, is talking about things that are going on at the cross. That is why Jesus is not ashamed to call them brothers and sisters, saying, I will proclaim your name to my brothers and sisters. I will sing hymns to you in the congregation. And again, I will trust in him. And again, here I am with the children God gave me. So, Jesus here, according to the writer of Hebrews, quoting Psalm 22 again. Now, we looked at Psalm 22 a few days ago, and Jesus is quoting Psalm 22 on the cross, and the very first verse is, my God, why have you forsaken me? And that's what we talked about last week in Grace Under Pressure. But here, the writer of Hebrews is saying that Jesus is also saying on the cross and in the cross context that I will proclaim your name to my brothers and sisters. I will sing hymns to you in the congregation. So you've got these two statements. And then he finishes with, here I am with the children God gave me. Now again, Jesus is quoting Psalm 22. He's also quoting Isaiah 8. And both of those passages find their fulfillment in Jesus and the cross and resurrection. But in the cross and resurrection, then, according to this writer of Hebrews, in putting these words in Jesus' mouth and basically saying this is what Jesus says, and I don't think he's really putting words in the mouth. This is who Jesus is and what he says for us, because Jesus is the fulfillment of that psalm. Jesus says, I will proclaim your name. And Jesus says, I will sing hymns to you in your congregation. Here I am with God's children. That makes Jesus the worship leader. We're not used to thinking about Jesus being the worship leader in any of our worship services, but he is. He's placing the worship service in the context of the cross. And the worship service in the context of the cross is Jesus proclaiming to us, singing to us, and being with us as God's children. And that begins to rub up against the way we typically think about worship. We often think about worship as something we do. There's something to be said for praise and thanksgiving. But what's funny is, if we think about it, that worship is something that we are doing and we're actively pursuing. And a lot of our songs, many of the songs that are out there talk about, hey, I'm going to do this, hey, I'm going to do that, and here I am for you. And even here I am to worship, nothing wrong, I love that song. But it's talking about me and what I am doing. So we're often thinking about worship as what we do. The funny thing is that most of us, when we talk about our salvation, we talk about it as something that God is doing. And I have to wonder then, if salvation is about what God is doing and it continues to do in me, in sanctification, which is, by the way, the word sanctify there kind of pulls this in as well, then maybe our worship kind of functions like our salvation. Again, we readily admit that our being right with God is not something that we do, and our living up to the standards that God requires is not something that we can do. And all of that is something that Jesus has to do for us. Now here we have the writer of Hebrews saying, Jesus is actually doing this for you in the worship service. I will proclaim your name to the congregation. I will sing to the congregation. Here I am with God's children. Talking about worship. So worship, based on these verses, I think we have to think long and hard about who's doing what in worship. And I think the thing that we come away with here in these verses is that the worship service is a place where God's doing something to us and for us before we even respond in praise and thanksgiving. And there's, again, no question our praise and thanksgiving are part of this. But when Jesus is quoting this psalm, he's placing himself in the worship service as the worship leader. So there's three things, very short. We're not going to keep going here. Three things. First of all, we have already said it. Worship is about God's initiation. Worship is about what God is doing for us. God comes to us in worship. He meets us in worship. He meets us. Jesus is meeting us in word and song. And it's why I think good worship music is more vertical, or talking about the vertical, than it is horizontal. Good worship is more about what God is doing for us, to us, and through us, and the things that he has done for us on the cross and in the resurrection, than what we're doing for God or what we're doing for others, or how I even feel about everything that's going on. Again, there's nothing wrong with singing about some of that stuff, but in worship, first and foremost, is God's initiation into the worship service. It's what he's doing for us. And in Hebrews, he's working through word, the proclamation, he's working through song, coming to us. And so I think that has a big bearing on the content of what we're singing about in worship, what God is doing for us, reminding us of Him, telling ourselves over and over in the verses and the choruses what God is doing and for us in Jesus. And then the second thing here in Hebrews is that the content of worship is predominantly about the cross and resurrection, because that's the context in which all of this takes place. If Christ is quoting Psalm 22, and Psalm 22 is a cross psalm. It's Christ fulfills what's going on in that Psalm of David. And so we hear at the end, toward the end of Psalm 22, what Jesus is actually thinking. And what he's thinking is he's going to proclaim, he's going to sing. And then he's quoting Isaiah. In the service, I'm with God's children. It's about what Jesus is doing for us. And so the content of what we're singing, the content of what we're proclaiming, is dominated by the cross and resurrection. And Paul said, I preach Christ crucified. And that's not just for evangelism. He preaches Christ crucified for all of the Christian life. It's not this, oh, hey, we're going to preach Christ crucified today because this is an evangelistic sermon. No. This is a rubber meets the road sermon on here's how we live our lives the other 6 days of the week. We're going to park ourselves at the cross. Because it's only the cross that has power for us, to give us for living life. It's not going to come from God's commands. God's commands cannot bring life into what we're doing. It shapes what we're doing. It shapes how we think. But there's no power there. The power in living life for Jesus and living life for our neighbors comes from the cross. And it's grounded in the cross. And so we're going to talk about the cross. We're going to talk about the forgiveness. We're going to talk about the life. We're going to talk about the salvation. And it's not that all those other things aren't important, but all of those things are subservient to and serve Christ crucified. In fact, that's the story of the Bible. The story of the Bible is Christ crucified. That's why Paul talks that way. Then the third thing, here I am with God's children. Christ is with us in the moment. He's with us in the service. Always. That's why I go running to church on Sunday, because I know Jesus is going to be there. He promised. Here he is. Hebrews 2. Hebrews 2. You want to know one of those places where we find the promise that Jesus is going to be among us? Then I can guarantee you, at the table on Sunday, we're imperfect. We don't, there's a lot of things we don't do well. You have to put up with me, right? You're gonna see me there. You're gonna see Chad and all his warts at the table. But you know what? It's not about me. It's about Jesus. And Jesus meets us at the table. He meets us. If you worship someplace else, wherever you're worshiping on Sunday, he meets you there. He's going to be there because he promised to be among God's people. He promised to be in the proclamation. He's promised to be in the songs. He's promised to be among you. Here I am with God's children. That is his heart's cry. It's what Jesus wants. It's his desire. Again, we're hearing Jesus. It's the thing that he wants. It's why he died. You know why he died? He died for our sins. Yes, you know why he died for our sins? Because he wants to be with us. He wants to be with us. He wants to love on us. He wants to give us his grace. He wants to sing to us and in the service. And so he's doing that. And he's again proclaiming his name. He's providing himself in the proclamation, and the proclamation shows up at the table in the word preached and in the sacrament, in the Lord's Supper. Jesus is proclaiming himself again in the broken body and the shed blood. So anyway, that is, again, Jones and Strock in their Lenten devotional talking about this, and it's just a great topic. We could go on. You already know, you can always see I could go on and on and on about this, but anyway, Jesus is our worship leader. He is. He's the worship leader. And we have worship leaders. And, when they're leading worship, what they're doing, first and foremost, is they are providing and helping provide this space. They're part of this space in which God comes to us and meets us in the proclamation of the word and in song. That's the role of our earthly worship leaders, is to kind of facilitate all that and make sure that that happens, that Christ is going to be there in his word and in song and certainly in his word and sacrament. So I hope you have a great Friday evening. We're going to have Grace Under Pressure again on Sunday. We're talking about "It is finished," another saying of Jesus on the cross. It's one of the greatest sayings, the three greatest words in the English language, the greatest three-word sentence in the English language, in my opinion. So we're going to be talking about that on Sunday. So show up at 10:30 at Los Fresnos Community Center. That is our conversation at the table for this Friday night. I hope you have a great evening. Again, you can rest well tonight. Jesus has you. Have a good